Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Great to be back with y'all. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeing, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you. I hope Santa was good to you. I know that you probably deserve coal in your stockings, but maybe he was being compassionate this year. And I want to wish a Happy New Year to all of our viewers and listeners, and for a new year in the fight for liberty.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Richard. I trust that you've come to the realization that the federal government is not supposed to be Santa Claus.
But isn't that in the Constitution?
Yeah, I'm sure he's going to be bringing lots of presents, which is a good segue into our topic today. We've been discussing socialism, and we worked our way up to the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s. So we're going to discuss one of the great Santa Claus presents that the Roosevelt administration bequeathed to us, and that's Social Security. I mean, we've talked about socialism generally, the pure ideal of socialism where the state owns all of the means of production or the results of production. And we've talked about various aspects of the New Deal revolution in America, the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was going to cartelize American business and industry. It's time now, though, to discuss specific social programs, socialist programs that are inherent to the American way of life, as well as people all over the world. And the crown jewel of the socialist programs is Social Security. And what we're talking about, of course, is a program where the government takes money from one group of people and transfers it to another group of people after deducting what it considers its administrative costs, the salaries of the bureaucrats who are administering the program, the expenses of performing this, quote, service for the American people. And so you have an entire generation now of people in our age group, seniors, that are on this dole, and many of them have convinced themselves that they're just getting their money back. I mean, I hear that all the time. I'm sure you do. That, Jacob, I'm just getting my money back. I've been putting into this system for 30 years, and now I have the right to get it back. Well, it's really just self-deception. This is a standard socialist program, welfare state program. It's no different in principle from food stamps, from agricultural subsidies, corporate bailouts, foreign aid to dictators. Nobody puts money into anything. They may call it a FICA tax, but it's no different than if they had a sales tax or an income tax increase to fund this program along with all the other programs. The way I put it sometimes is, look how much money I've put into sales taxes over the years. Do I have a right to get my money back? Well, of course not. Everybody's taxed. And where this money is coming from with respect to seniors is from the younger people in society. And that's what every senior needs to recognize, that the state is being used to take money from the younger group of people, many of whom are struggling mightily in life, especially people just starting out in life. They can't save a nest egg. They can't get enough money for a down payment on a house. Many of them are still living with their parents because they can't afford an apartment. Many of them are deferring marriage. And in large part, it's because not only because the Federal Reserve has debased our currency and impoverished people that way, but it's because of the large amount of money that's being taken out of people's paycheck to fund everything, all the welfare state programs, including Social Security and Medicare and farm subsidies, corporate bailouts, and then also all the warfare state programs, which we'll still talk about, all the overseas escapades and so forth. So that's really what Social Security is all about. It's the forcible taking of money from one group of people in order to give it to another group of people. And I'd be the first one to acknowledge that the state has left people worse off than they would have been. But Richard, when you and I were starting the Future of Freedom Foundation 30 years ago, We said this. We were advocating. Let's get rid of the income tax. Let's leave people free to keep everything they earned. No more mandatory charity, which is what Social Security and Medicare and all these other social programs are. They're mandatory charity. Let's get rid of those and leave people free to manage their own money. And we had a tough time convincing people of this. This was 30 years ago. People said, oh, you libertarians are too radical and so forth. And we said that this is going to leave you more impoverished. But the large number of Americans, no, you libertarians are too radical. Well, now 30 years later, people are saying, well, Jacob, I don't have enough savings anymore. Well, we told you this. This is what we were saying 30 years ago when we started the Future of Freedom Foundation. But that's water under the bridge. The question is, what do we do from this point on? And what I'm saying we do is just repeal Social Security. Now, I know there's people that say, oh, Jacob, it's got to be done gradually, and it's got to be done piecemeal, and people have a right since they're dependent on it. I don't buy any of that. Why? Because one is that I want a free society. And a free society necessarily means no infringements on liberty. And as long as you've got Social Security, the socialist program in our midst, you cannot consider yourself free. There's just no way that freedom necessarily means keeping everything you earn and you deciding what to do with it. But I also have no doubts that freedom works. If Social Security were repealed today, there is no doubt in my mind that children, grandchildren, community groups, church groups, friends, neighbors, foundations that would be giving out grants to people would come through and take care of people who really are in need. Many Social Security recipients don't need the money. They're sufficiently wealthy. There's many that might have to go to work. There's nothing wrong with going to work when you're in your 60s or 70s. I see it all the time in Walmart or whatever. I see elderly people working. It keeps them in the mainstream of life, interacting with young people. But there is a group in society that really does need the assistance. And that's where children and grandchildren and community groups and churches and so forth should be given that opportunity. And I have no doubts that would work. None at all. And so that's what we need to do in this era, Richard. In terms of a free society, we got to get rid of this massive socialist program. We've got to leave people free to manage their own resources, their own lives, and we've got to show people that freedom and free markets really do work. What do you think?
Well, first, I think you have to stop being so wishy-washy. Tell us what you really think about Social Security. But let me sort of complement your remarks with the way I sometimes like to do it from a bit of the historical perspective. Where did the idea of modern Social Security come from? And again, its roots were in Imperial Germany during the time of Otto von Bismarck as the Chancellor of Imperial Germany in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, as a way of preempting the attractiveness of the more radical socialists, the Social Democratic Party that was gaining strength and then membership in the German parliament, the Reichstag. Bismarck persuaded the Kaiser, the Emperor of Imperial Germany, and the conservative parties to institute these programs to sort of win over the votes and the support of those who were attracted to the more radical socialist ideas of people like Karl Marx and others. And they made this, and it was in Imperial Germany that the phrase that we still sometimes hear, a government that will care for you from cradle to grave. That phrase came from Imperial Germany in the late 19th century. And again, as we've talked about, these American intellectuals went over to Germany, studied there in the 1880s and 1890s, became the vanguard of what was called the progressive movement in the United States in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And they then laid the intellectual and ideological and policy seeds for making the case for what became the Social Security program implemented in the United States under the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal years of 1935. Now, when this was first set up, the retirement age was 65. The eligibility age was 65 to collect Social Security. And why did they make it 65? Because given the demography at the time, most Americans didn't live much beyond 65. So the United States government, through a taxing process, was committing itself to transfer from the working age people of that time to a retired age population, which was expected to basically die out after a couple of 3, maybe 5 years of collecting Social Security at the most. So this was a program that was not going, which was sort of rigged to assure that it wasn't even going to cost very much. But then something very strange happened. Medical knowledge and technology improved, and rising standards of living, the quality of life, our nutritional availabilities have resulted is that many Americans live far beyond 65 today. Let me give an example. There's a famous American historian who just died this past week, Gertrude Himmelfarb. She was an expert on the ideas and the life of the famous classical liberal British historian Lord Acton. She just died at the age of 97 this past Monday. So, and well, you say, oh, that's one person. But the point is, that's not the case. My mother-in-law, who died about 10 years, well, less than that, she lived until 95. More and more people are living not just into their 70s, but into their 80s and their 90s. So this is a long period of responsibility that the government has taken on for these intergenerational transfers. Now, what has happened is that we are also an aging population. How are we an aging population? Well, there are more people living longer after retirement. But the working age population, as in relation to that, has been shrinking. For instance, in the 1950s and 1960s, there were approximately 5 working Americans for every single retired person eligible for Social Security. So approximately 5 people had to be taxed to redistribute the Social Security payment to one retiree. So each of these 5 people had to pay 1/5 of the cost to cover that guy's Social Security check. Now, in fact, the amount collected was far above this. So the Social Security Administration accumulated this huge surplus. Oh, isn't that the lockbox where all of our money is sitting, Jacob, that people could draw upon? Because as you said, well, I paid my fair share. I'm just getting my money back. Well, what was that surplus done with? Well, during all these years, guess what the rest of the federal government has been running? You guessed it, a budget deficit. Now, the federal government does go out into the financial markets and borrow money. Or the Federal Reserve indirectly will create money to cover the government's budget deficits. But a good portion of covering the rest of the government's deficit spending was covered by taking the surpluses out of the Social Security account and using that money to cover the annual expenses in excess of taxes of Uncle Sam. And what did the U.S. government put into the, metaphorically, lockbox? They just put an IOU, a promise to itself that it would pay one of its other branches in the future for the money it used from that surplus to cover the far larger total deficit that the government was experiencing. Now, a number of things have been happening, Jacob. First of all, the working age population as in relation to the retired population has been changing. Today, 2019, 2020, it's closer to about 3 working age people to every retired person. So that has had to be taxed. Those 3 people have had to be taxed enough to cover this guy's Social Security check. It has been tending not to be enough. So what has been happening? Well, there was in the lockbox all of these Uncle Sam's IOUs to itself to pay back, right? And the Social Security Agency has been having to draw upon those promises to pay back. The net result is that we are at a point where, for example, the Congressional Budget Office, that's the office set up by Congress. It's employed by economists and statisticians who are meant just to be the fact and policy wonks. Here's the legislation existing or proposed. What would it cost? Who would be eligible? What are the longer-term expense consequences? They're just the number crunchers, okay? They're just meant to be the number crunchers. Now, based upon the numbers, the fact is within about 10 years, the Social Security Administration will have drawn all of the rest of the government's IOUs to pay back. And they're only going to be maybe 2 to 2.5 working age people, certainly within 20 years, to cover one of these. We're just talking the facts here, not the issues that we're just the facts man here now. What is the nature and the sustainability of the system? The fact is that within 10 to 20 years for sure, they can fudge things. There will not be enough money coming into Social Security from the working age population. All of the government's IOUs to itself will have been, quote, repaid back. And under the current Social Security legislation, all that the Social Security can pay out is what it collects in taxes as repayment of obligations with previous surpluses. So certainly within 15 to 20 years, when they're dependent totally and only on Social Security taxes being collected on a regular basis, there will not be enough money to pay everybody that is now eligible, that older percentage of the population. The upshot of it is, again, the Congressional Budget Office estimated when that happens, Social Security payments will have to be cut by approximately 25%. So imagine that 1 month you got paid $100 by the Social Security Administration. Now, next month comes and your new check comes and it's $75 instead. I think a lot of people are going to notice that. So just institutionally, demographically, the system has now reached its end. The Ponzi game has reached its conclusion where there's not enough new money coming in to pay the suckers who got involved in earlier in the system. And the other thing that this is highlighting and will certainly highlight, Jacob, is that unlike this delusion that you were highlighting, oh, but it's my money. It is not. The Social Security system has always been an intergenerational redistributive program. It takes from the working age population and transfers money to the retired population. So rather than George today, who's collecting welfare checks, getting a check from somebody else in the same generation, George and Sam are the same age, one gets welfare checks, and the doesn't pays the money to pay the welfare guy. What we now have is intergenerational from the working age to the retired age. And that is now skewed so much that this is going to not be a sustainable program. Now, again, before we get to the other issues that you raised, what can we expect? What do we expect always from politicians? To kick the can of uncomfortable issues down the road and to put on Band-Aids. They're going to try to raise the retirement age. Oh, you can't collect the full payment until 72 or 75. They're going to raise Social Security taxes, or they're going to introduce a means test. As you were saying, a lot of people are sufficiently wealthy or with private retirement monies that they could easily get by without Social Security. They're going to have a means test where instead of everybody who's paid in, they get something, whether you're poverty-stricken or a zillionaire, you get your Social Security check. They're going to change that. They're going to make it a means test. Well, if you've accumulated above a certain amount of wealth and retirement income, you're going to get either a smaller payment or zero. And this is how they're going to play the game. But it all doesn't change the fact that it remains a paternalistic program where the government has conned the entire population for decades and involves an element of immorality. It's lied to the people, it is stolen from the people, and has made promises that it cannot keep. The only answer to this is basically the one that you were suggesting towards the end of your comments, and that is this system has to be ended, and the sooner the better, to leave people who are working with the money in their pockets to plan for their own retirement and to have the means to, as you were saying, to help those who may still need financial assistance due to the fact that government has conned them out of huge portions of their earned incomes over the decades of their own working age period. So as a consequence, we need to make people aware of the reality of the Ponzi nature. It's unsustainable, but you can't count on it. It has been immoral and unethical from the start. And the only answer is to get the government out of it and make retirement a matter of the private sector through people decide how, where, and when, so as to secure their own family's needs and that of relatives or those who through charity they will help in the society as a whole. Otherwise, we will just continue with this until it is a disaster for all, from which all we'll have is the financial rubble left behind.
Yeah, you've raised a lot of good points. Let me address some of them. The matter about Bismarck, There's actually a portrait of Bismarck on the website of the Social Security Administration,
Yeah.
which highlights the fact that this came from Germany, this idea. So there's no portrait of Madison or Washington or Jefferson on the Social Security website because they wouldn't have had anything to do with the kind of program that uses government to take money from one person and give it to another person. They understood this was just political theft, which was why they brought into existence a society where most everyone was free to keep everything he earned, the exception, of course, being the horrific institution of slavery, but where people were free to keep everything they earned and they decide what to do with it. And then your other point about, where people put in and they have a right to get back, I think the first Social Security recipient on a monthly basis was a lady named Ida Mae Fuller. And she had put in a total of $64, somewhere around that, and ended up living to, I don't know, her 80s or something, where proving what you said, where she ended up getting like 20-something thousand dollars on her $64 investment, which showed that it's just a socialist program. It's taking money, she's not getting back her $64 with interest. She's getting money from young people through the political process and then funding her retirement. And then your example of the so-called lockbox reminded me of a family where the father and mother save, let's say, $50,000 for their kids' education over a long period of years, and they put it in the home safe. It's in there, cash, 50 grand cash. And one year they decide to go on vacation to Europe for a few months, and they go out and just spend it all. And the kid comes along and he says, "How's my fund doing, my education fund?" "Oh, it's no problem. It's fully funded with one great big IOU. I owe you $50,000. Well, of course, it's just nonsense. I mean, an IOU means nothing as compared to the cash. And as you point out, it's been a big con, but people have also enabled themselves to get conned. It was a deliberate, conscious effort not to face reality, because from the very beginning, the law itself, and everybody could go to a lawyer if they wanted to over the past 30 years and say, "Would you tell me about Social Security?" Read the law. The lawyer would read the law and say, "All I can tell you is this is a straight social welfare program. It can be repealed at any time. You don't have any contractual rights to it. There's no fraud involved here. Here's what the law says." So people really permitted themselves to be deceived as well. The fact is that this is a socialist program. It takes money from one group of people and gives it to another group of people. And it's really an insult to young people. When you stop to think about it, Richard, this program is saying to young people, you cannot be trusted with freedom. We have to have this mandated program because you're a bad people. You will not take care of your parents. You will not take care of your grandparents when they're in need, or other people in the community. So we have to have this program to force you to do so. And so it really is a program of mandatory, coerced charity. And in the process, the advocates of this program say, "Oh, this shows how good and caring and compassionate the American people are. Look how they take care of the elderly through the Internal Revenue Service." Well, this is just nonsense. There's nothing care and compassion about mandates and coercion and the Internal Revenue Service. The fact is, if you don't pay your taxes, we all know what'll happen. They'll come after you, they'll prosecute you, they'll seize all your assets, they'll put you in jail. So there's nothing voluntary about the payment of taxes. Well, how can something that's involuntary, that's based on coercion and mandates, be reconciled with care and compassion or religious principles, like honor thy mother and thy father? They can't be. Force and care and compassion are opposites. The only care and compassion that has any meaning at all is when it comes out of the willing, voluntary heart of the individual. You want to honor your mother and father? You help them out when they need help with money or time or assistance or going to their house or helping them in the hospital. That's when life has meaning. When you write that check to the Internal Revenue Service or the Department of the Treasury on April 15th, that has no meaning at all in terms of care, compassion, or religious principles. And so, finally, when we're talking about a free society, there's even libertarians that say, "Oh, well, we should gradually phase this out. Leave the current generation free to continue this really what amounts to plunder for, let's say, 20 or 30 more years. So that means we're going to defer freedom for 20 or 30 more years, because freedom necessarily means the absence of socialism. Well, that doesn't interest me. I'm at a point in my life where I want freedom now. And in order to achieve freedom now, you've got to eliminate, not reform and not gradually reduce infringements on liberty. We've got to eliminate it now. And that's really what freedom's all about, the right to keep everything you earn and you decide what to do with it. And again, freedom works. There's no reason to doubt that it does work. Freedom has always worked. But you've got to have trust in people, and people have to get trust in themselves. They have to get trust in others. And from my religious faith, you got to have trust in God. You got to eliminate this trust in the coercive apparatus of government to force people to be so-called good, caring, and compassionate.
Yeah, and history is an important teacher. And in response to the thing you were saying, trust people to care for themselves, to assist family members, to just be charitable for those who may need that support. And people say, oh, how can that ever happen? The fact is that was the 19th century in both the United States and in Great Britain. When Alexis de Tocqueville, the famous French social philosopher and author, came to the United States in the 1830s, spent a good amount of time here, went back to France, and wrote his famous classic of political philosophy, Democracy in America. There's a section, it's a 2-volume work, in volume 2, in which he talks about an institutional order that he thinks that Europeans should pay special attention to. And that was the institutions of what today we call civil society. The voluntary associations that he saw all across the land, whether it be the North, the Central states, the Southern states, some of the Western states that were already in existence at that time, that communities of people would get together, whether it be for religious purposes, philanthropic purposes, charity, intellectual or educational purposes. They would form private associations, voluntary associations, to serve and advance the causes and purposes and community needs that these people saw in front of them, that no one turned to the state for these purposes. And other observers who came to the United States said that this was a unique mark of the American character, that people did not wait for the state, and in fact did not trust and have confidence in the state to take care of these human needs of people in society. And then if I can just mention one other thing, and that is the friendly societies of Great Britain throughout the 19th century. Beginning in the early decades of the 19th century, during the years of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, there were formed these voluntary associations that came to be called friendly societies. At first, they began as mutual insurance programs among workers, usually always what we would call the working class poor, for death benefits. The breadwinner dies, how are you going to pay for his funeral? The widow, the children. First, it began as mutual insurance programs for death benefits. Then became mutual insurance programs through these friendly societies, and that's what they were called, the friendly societies, for retirement, for health care, to have sort of like a savings account system, to be able to put money aside, to be able to buy a house at some point in your life. And these were the networks so great that by the end of the 19th century, historians of the British friendly societies estimate that between 2/3 to 3/4 of the entire British population was covered by these private sector insurance programs, including retirement, through these friendly societies. And those historians who have gone through the archival records of these societies, well, who were the members? Was it the wealthy workers who could afford to put money aside for retirement or medical insurance? No. The records show that the largest majority of participants were those in the lower income brackets, precisely because their incomes were so modest. They knew they needed to make the decision to set aside a few pence and pounds every year, every quarter, to subscribe to these insurance policies, because without them, the consequences would hit them the hardest if they didn't have these voluntary associations of mutual assistance of insurance to support them and their families through what might be hard and difficult times. So that was the private sector solution. Now, of course, all this knowledge, whether it be de Tocqueville's about America, the friendly societies in Great Britain, They've all gone down a memory hole, an Orwellian memory hole. That is, the facts disappear down a hole. But that doesn't change the fact that that is the history. People took responsibility in their own hands for themselves, for their family members, and their sense of an interdependent responsibility with others, either through insurance programs or just simple charity, both secular and religious. That is the free society's answers and solutions to these social problems that are presumed to be the basis and the need for government paternalistic involvement and coercion, as you highlighted. The fact is not. Free societies work when free men are set at liberty to find their own solutions by themselves and in voluntary consort with their fellow men. That is the history of liberty during its greater heyday of the 19th century. It serves as a hallmark and an example and a model for what could be even more of such success and generosity in a far more wealthier society today, if only the state could be gotten out of the way.
Yeah, you're really highlighting two separate systems that have existed in American history. You've got one system where people are free to keep everything they earn, no federal income tax, no IRS, and free to do what they want with their own money. No Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, foreign aid, that charity was entirely voluntary compared to the system that we've lived under, where you've got a massive income tax, a terrifying agency called the Internal Revenue Service, and all this mandatory charity in terms of Social Security, Medicare, farm subsidies, foreign aid to dictators, and the like. The other thing about 19th century America was the fierce sense of independence that the American people of that time had. There was that sense of self-reliance and can-do and, well, we can do this and we can do that. That's all gone here in the United States, at least in large part, because Roosevelt knew that once he got an entire generation of people, and then the next generation, and the third generation of people on this dole, and then it expanded to other areas of society, he knew that the government would have them because they would become like dependent. They would become weak, which is what we've ended up with. We have the most powerful government in history and really the weakest nation because while people conflate the nation and the government, it's actually two separate entities. And that's reflected in the Bill of Rights, which protects the nation from the federal government. But we've ended up with a nation of very weak, passive people, Richard. I mean, you can see this with the seniors today. These are the people, you recall, that were out in the streets protesting against the Vietnam War in the 60s. Stand up there in front of the Pentagon and saying, bring the troops home and so forth. What do you see them now that they're on the dole? Not only have they become passive in the face of all this overseas aggression, wars of aggression, invasions, occupations, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, they've even become warmongers, supporters of the Pentagon and the CIA. These were like the anti-war protesters in the 60s. Why? Because this is the government that's feeding them now. This is the government that prepares a little government trough that they go and feed at every month when they get their checks. They don't want to alienate the hand that's feeding them. So they become these passive or even worse, aggressive warmongers that are scared to death to antagonize the government by taking a stand against its overseas aggression, its killing machine overseas that is bringing so much damage and destruction here at home. So there's really nothing redeeming that can be said about Social Security, Richard. If there was a button right now that I could push that would eliminate it, I would push it without any hesitation whatsoever.
I can just add to that because you're saying a passive population, and I cannot do justice to quoting it with the eloquence with which Alexis de Tocqueville expresses it in Democracy in America. But he talks about a danger of a new democratic despotism, where the government isn't a monarch or a brutal tyrant, but seems to be the will of the people, in which the government shows itself as paternalistically caring, a shepherd over a flock of sheep, in which people are not hit in the face with a fist, but are just bent to be passive, obedient, to take for granted that the state will take care of them. And he considered that the more dangerous form of tyranny that the world faced in the future. And that is that sort of that benevolent despotism and tyranny and paternalism that we now see increasingly and more accepted, as you're pointing out, among the American population. We've lost the spirit in many ways, unfortunately, that exemplified the ideal and the model of what America was. And if it could be changed around, still could be.
On that excellent note, we'll wrap it up. We're out of time. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the show, and Happy New Year to you and to all of you who watch our show. If this is your first time being exposed to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. We've got 30 years worth of principled and compromising presentations of liberty. So, Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
And if I can just add one other thing, which is only, I think, appropriate for us to do. This is our first program in the new year 2020. And I know on your behalf, and if you'll permit me, I want to thank all of those viewers and listeners and supporters of FFF who may have generously given donations during the year-end period to make the work that Jacob through FFF and I helped try to do succeed and continue in this new year and into this new decade.
Yeah, let me reinforce that. Thank you very much. We took a couple weeks off up in the run up to the new year, but I know we came in and there's a lot of donations here. So if you haven't heard from us, thanking you. You'll be receiving a letter from us, and I'm very, very grateful for the support y'all given us. The money you gave us end of year supports our operations for the coming year. If you haven't given, and there's still time to do so, you can do so in the new year. It's a tax deduction, and we would greatly appreciate your support. So thank you again for helping us out. And Richard, look forward to another year of Libertarian Angle.
Until next time.